Welcome to Part 2 of Prolonging the Agony. According to the geopolitical thinking of the time, the real danger was not Germany's aggression, but Germany's potential, a potential that, once destroyed, would not return for generations. We're taught that the British naval blockade slowly strangled Germany into surrender, but if the blockade was so effective, why did the war drag on for years? And why did trade, finance, and profits continue to flow while civilians starved? According to chapters 4 and 5 of Prolonging the Agony, the blockade was never what it appeared to be. Chapter 4. The Myth of the Great Blockade, Lies and Deception. Chapter 4 challenges the popular belief that Britain's naval blockade was a decisive and humane weapon of war. Instead, the authors argue that the blockade was deliberately designed to fail, serving more as political theater than as a serious attempt to cut off Germany's war supplies. Rather than enforcing a close blockade of German ports, Britain adopted a distant and ineffective strategy. Despite public promises, particularly that by Winston Churchill, that the blockade would quickly cripple Germany, vital materials continued to flow almost uninterrupted. The legal framework governing naval warfare was vague, unratified, and intentionally left full of loopholes. Crucially, cotton, an essential component in explosives and munitions, was excluded from the contraband list. A weak and underpowered cruiser squadron was tasked with policing an enormous stretch of the North Sea, an almost impossible mission from the outset. Supplies from America were routinely rerouted through neutral Scandinavian countries and then passed on to Germany with official approval. Behind the scenes, a secret contraband committee within the Foreign Office quietly ensured that most intercepted cargo ships were released and allowed to proceed. Naval experts later accused the Admiralty of knowingly permitting Germany to remain supplied, thereby prolonging the war. Public pressure eventually forced a partial reversal. By mid-1915, mounting outrage in Parliament and the press led to cotton finally being declared contraband, after enormous profits had already been secured by Allied and American interests. The chapter concludes that the Great Blockade was less a weapon against Germany than a managed illusion, designed to protect financial interest while sustaining a long and lucrative war. Chapter 4 argues that the blockade wasn't meant to end the war, only to appear as if it might. Chapter 5. The Myth of the Great Blockade, Shameful Profits. Chapter 5 argues that Britain's naval blockade did more than fail. It generated enormous profits for neutral and Allied business interests, while prolonging the war itself. Scandinavian merchants, British re-exporters, American suppliers, international shippers, insurers, bankers, and financiers all benefited from keeping trade routes open to Germany through neutral countries. Trade with Scandinavia reached record levels during the war. Vital resources, grain, metals, and especially coal continued to flow despite Britain's public claims of economic warfare. British coal, essential for powering ships, factories, railways, and homes, was never fully embargoed. A complete cutoff from the start of the war, the authors argue, would have dramatically shortened the conflict. Instead, exports surged, profiteering soared, and coal prices at home rose so high that Britain's poor struggled to heat their homes. Neutral shipping thrived. Danish vessels replaced German ships in the Baltic, suffered virtually no losses to U-boats, and paid enormous dividends to shareholders. Meanwhile, the ores and metals crucial to German munitions production flowed freely through Sweden. British merchants even competed with American and imperial rivals to supply Germany indirectly. Evidence of excessive trade and corruption reached the Foreign Office through naval intelligence, but investigations were quietly buried. Parliament was repeatedly assured that the maximum possible was being done, an assurance that the authors describe as a whitewash. By late 1915, the blockade was openly mocked in the House of Lords as a farce that had prolonged the war rather than shortened it. Even after senior British and French commandeers commanders concluded in 1916 that the economic war had never been properly attempted, and that enforcing it could end the conflict. Official policy remained unchanged. The chapter concludes that the blockade's true function was not to defeat Germany quickly, but to protect profits, preserve trade, and sustain a long war from which powerful interests continued to benefit. Chapter 5 argues that the blockade didn't starve Germany, it fed a war economy built on profit and denial. The real irony is that the blockade would not be enforced until the war was over. To enforce the Versailles treaties upon a starving Germany that had no other choice to accept these preposterous treaty with reparations and land concessions that they would not otherwise have made. The Allied blockade is remembered as a decisive weapon, a slow, grinding force that made defeat inevitable. But chapters 4 and 5 of Prolonging the Agony argue that inevitability is a story told after the fact. According to the book, the blockade was never absolute. It was selective, porous, and unevenly enforced. Trade moved through neutral channels. Finance adapted. Profits did not vanish, they concentrated. Civilian suffering was real, but suffering alone did not end the war. If starvation were enough, the conflict would have ended years earlier. Instead, the blockade functioned as an economic pressure without resolution, maintaining leverage while allowing the war itself to continue. This does not require secret plots or hidden villains. It only requires one assumption: that prolonged conflict served certain strategic and economic interests better than a swift conclusion. World War I, as presented here, was not simply mismanaged, it was managed. And when war becomes a managed system, its purpose quietly shifts from victory to endurance. But economic pressure alone could not end the war, so attention turned elsewhere, away from the Western Front, and toward a different kind of solution, a shortcut, a decisive stroke, a way to break the stalemate without changing the system that sustained it. That solution lay in the Ottoman Empire. Please tune in for the next episode.